You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Okay, in this particular segment, we're going to take a look at the Spanish-American War, and we're going to do it in two parts. Last week, we covered labor's involvement in attempting to correct the injustice of capitalist greed and monopolization at the turn of the century. And today, we're going to take a look at the notion of U.S. imperialism, and we're going to take a look at the Spanish-American War, Part 1. So one of the things that's most important to understand is that when we look at United States economic expansion in the 20th century, historians concur that foreign policy is rooted in what is known as economic opportunity, civil liberty, social Darwinism, and Christian spirituality. Indeed, when we understand the motivating ideas of U.S. imperialism, they are summarily incorporated in the notion of national honor, commerce, racial superiority, and this notion called altruism. So when we study U.S. government foreign policy services, let's appreciate and understand that the United States-based multinational corporations, of which we depend our livelihood on, they do not venture into the world naked and exposed, but they go with the assistance and the protection of the American government. So let's understand something about the government foreign policy services. There is an economic historian named Gabriel Kolko, and he states that in the aggregate, in his research, he found that it is a fact that the final intended result of the whole course of United States foreign policy after the Civil War was to optimize the power and the profit of American capitalism in the global economy, striving for the political and military preconditions essential to the attainment of that end. So when we talk about global corporations today, global corporations are vital to the U.S. economy. The federal government must be concerned with their stability. The federal government must be concerned with their profitability. So you have to recognize that to undermine corporate goals is to undermine the economy. And it is this economy that allows the government to maintain its legitimacy in the public's view. So the framework of U.S. foreign policy is founded on the close cooperation between the government and American businesses in its overseas operations. And this is where war comes into existence. So let's recognize there is what is known as the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization. And these two organizations are very important because they go around the world and they make sure that U.S. corporations can gain investment guarantee treaties, that U.S. corporations are able to provide aid programs to any country that is wanting to develop. And most importantly, they do it through manipulative means by either if a country does not want to go along with the International Monetary Fund or the World Trade Organization, then they will cut off their foreign aid, or they'll manipulate their lending policies, or they'll do it through what are known as tariff policies. And this is known as the importance of the International Monetary Fund and the World Trade Organization. This is part of the U.S. foreign policy services. And if that doesn't work, when the United States goes throughout the world, again, with regards to global corporations, these global corporations are vital to the U.S. economy. So the federal government is concerned with their stability and profitability. And so the federal government does not undermine the goals because then it'll undermine the economy of which we survive in. So again, the framework of foreign policy is founded on the close cooperation between government and American businesses in its overseas operations. So if a country does not like what the United States is doing, then the United States will go into that country and it will do some coercive actions. It will foster disruption through the CIA. It will create internal subversion, all right? It will outright assassinate foreign leaders. And if that doesn't work, then it will have sponsored direct military intervention or war. So it's understood, and it's very important to recognize these coercive actions. Now, when we look at the history of the United States overseas administration, historians officially recognize that this overseas administration begins in the 1890s, in the last decade of the 19th century. Because starting in the 1880s and catching fire in the 1890s, there developed a religious revival in international political discourse. It was known as an imperialism of righteousness. The world was divided between clean, civilized Christian nations versus despicable heathen cultures. And since the United States experienced a 19th century history of free security in the world, and since there were no bodies of law nor police powers to enforce decisions, the world wars of the 1890s encouraged the United States to combine its economic power with its military power. And this combination required a new kind of international power. So historians kind of take a look at the overseas administration and they question, they kind of understand, well, was it a break from the past? Many historians say, well, no, it wasn't a break from the past because it was in one sense a continuation of this notion of manifest destiny. And when we take a look at 19th century United States, a continental expansion, it is a continuation, and some people don't see it as a break from the past. But others see it that it was because in the 1890s there was a crisis in capitalism, and at that time there was this whole notion of laissez-faire economics and the survival of the fittest on the market. And they applied that to society in the form of what was known as social Darwinism. And most importantly, in the 1890s, there was tremendous struggles in the American economically as well as politically and socially. There was the populist revolt. There was agrarian unrest. There was labor unrest. So this combination of military power with economic power required a new kind of international power. And so the ripest melon for the exercise of this power was the remaining Spanish Empire of the colonial era. So the United States in the 1890s is going to decide to challenge the Spanish. Most Latin American nations were detached from what was happening in the colonies of Spain. So let's take a look at some independence movements and how the United States is going to be involved in those movements. There's known as the Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Filipino independence movements. These were the last colonies of Spain. Spain controlled Cuba, controlled Puerto Rico, and controlled the Philippines. So when we take a look at American businesses, Americans had investments in Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, Hawaii, and the Philippines. So in the textbooks, it's easy to see why historians label the war with the Spanish as the Spanish-American War. Yet Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Filipinos had been fighting for their independence from Spain for over 60 years. Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Filipinos were involved in their independence movements. So when we look at the foreign policy events in the 1890s, we see that the war was commonly coined as the Spanish-American War of 1898, but it was actually three independence movements that the United States is going to interfere with. Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines were undergoing revolutions to end colonialism, to end slavery, and they had been involved for over 60 years against the Spanish and the Spanish colonial rule. In fact, Puerto Ricans began their liberation with a Grito de Lares on September 28, 1868. Now, the result of this war, which is identified in today's history books as a fight between the Spanish and the Americans, was that the United States would now control Cuba, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. So in 1898, the United States officially became an imperial power. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look and end this one session by taking a look at what happened to Cuba and Puerto Rico and what happened to the Cubans and the Puerto Ricans as a result of this war. So let's go to that film clip that will end this particular session. This is part one.
30 million people immigrated to the United States. The tired, huddled masses that made Ellis Island a beacon of hope.